and of course we can't go through all these murder counts, but what we have done is, in 20 of these murders, we said there was no direct evidence. The prosecution has now come back and said, well, in fact, there was direct evidence, and we have gone through that. But even that, when we look at that, it is once again emblematic of how the prosecution has developed these murder counts. If we look at one of the incidents, 383, in the further clarification schedule, it's on page 11 of the annex. This is a person who was killed in and around the Doña Lapat's area, and what it says in the OTP analysis was that this person was probably executed by an HV, member of the HV, or a policeman after being injured. Now, interesting analysis. Interesting analysis because they made it up. Number one, they leave out the fact that this individual was killed as told by a civilian policeman, that the person was killed by a civilian policeman during a hostilities on the 12th of August. On the 13th of August, you recall, Your Honor, it was a counterattack during that period of time. No point is it reflect in there that the HV was involved in any point, in any aspect of this. Yet the prosecution includes that in their analysis in an attempt, I suggest to you, to tie this back to General Gotovine. And number two, even they used, I guess it's the word of the use, probable, is how their back-out argument is here, is that they have no evidence this is a murder at all, because they were told it was happened in hostilities. Nevertheless, they include it. They include one other. I would try to get through these quickly, Mr. President. An individual.
Mr. Q.
Yes. I'm sorry. In the interest of time, Mr. President, giving the appropriate time to Mr. Akhavan, if we, Your Honor, look at the additional items that have been set forth here, in all of the murders that have laid out, they once again don't establish that this murder actually took place, that it was in fact a murder, and they have essentially made up in many instances out of whole cloth the causes of these injuries, and certainly have not met their burden of proof. It is the job of prosecution to exclude all other reasonable inferences consistent with the acquittal of the accused. It's not their job. It's not their job, as raised by Mr. Hederali yesterday, to raise possible inferences that simply because there's no cause of death, one can exclude murder. Their job is to prove these charges against these accused beyond a reasonable doubt. These charges are fated. They have a fatal flaw, and that flaw is, number one, the inability to prove in many instances that a murder took place, but more importantly, number two, any attempt or any proof to tie these matters back to the accused. I will now cede the floor to Dr. Akhavan.
Thank you, Mr. Kiel. Mr. Mistich. Yes, oh, you are just assisting, and yes.
And while doing that, Mr. President, I made an incorrect reference to the evidence this morning. I referred to the Mladena diary on the issue of phosphoric shells, and the proper court citation is D1465, page 26 in the E-Court.
Yes, that was exactly the issue I raised with the prosecution as to the source of phosphoric shells being used or not being used.
And Mr. President, my apologies to the Chamber and, of course, to the interpreters by escalating speed towards the end there, but do try to get through that, but I apologize.
You certainly have improved over the last 2 years, Mr. Kiel. Mr. Akhavan, please proceed. And, I told you that I would be very strict in time, and that's what I'm going to be. Please proceed.
Mr. President, if I could just advise the Chamber that we were informed by the court usher that Mr. Mistich only took 25 minutes yesterday. So my understanding is that we have an additional 5 minutes, which should bring us to just past 12 o'clock. That is how we had very strictly kept the time.
Yes, what I earlier said is that if at the end of the day we are 7 minutes short, that of course would not Mr. Kiu, certainly in his last 10 lines, was fully repetitious. So therefore, that time is...
I will keep strictly to the time, sir.
Please proceed.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the trial chamber, I'm pleased and honored to appear once again before you on behalf of General Gotovina. My colleagues have addressed the evidence in this case. I shall now set forth our concluding submissions on whether the prosecution has proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt in light of the applicable law and elements of crime. The defendant, Ante Gotovina, a high-ranking military commander, is charged with widespread and systematic violations of humanitarian law. What is at the root of this law against which this trial chamber must measure his conduct? In 1952, shortly after the adoption of the Geneva Conventions in 1949, Sir Hirsch Lauterpacht famously remarked, "If international law is at the vanishing point of law, the law of war is perhaps even more conspicuously at the vanishing point of international law." In the shadow of the Second World War, Sir Hirsch was referring to the basic challenge of imposing legal constraints on the waging of war, the basic challenge of humanizing an inherently violent and inhumane activity. As Professor Kalshoven has explained, humanitarian law does not by any means purport to turn war into a fashionable and basically humane activity. Far more modestly, it aims to restrain the parties to an armed conflict from wanton cruelty and ruthlessness. Even so, war remains what it always was, a horrifying phenomenon. What lies at the root of the laws of war is a careful balance between humanitarian protection and military necessity. This balance was as relevant at the time of the 1863 Lieber Code as it is today. The former ICRC legal advisor, Louise Doswell Beck, observed that the States Negotiating Protocol 1 of 1977 had this balance firmly in mind so as to codify a law that was acceptable to their military staff. Codify a law that was acceptable to their military staff. Therein lies the viability of humanitarian law at the vanishing point of international law. It is a code of conduct that is acceptable to military commanders around the world because it does not ignore the horrifying realities of warfare. It may be tempting to expand humanitarian law's scope of protection by progressively diminishing the centuries-old balance with military necessity. It may be satisfying to develop the most exacting standards that can only be achieved by the best armies fighting in the best circumstances with the best weapons, a legal utopia that sanitizes the horrifying realities of war. The law that is unrealistic is also a law that is irrelevant. A law that is unrealistic will be ignored by the vast majority of military commanders around the world who are engaged in warfare. Military commanders without the superior training and weaponry of the armed forces of the most advanced nations. In order to arrive at a conclusion of innocence or guilt, the trial chamber must determine whether General Gotovina acted reasonably given the realities of the war that Croatia confronted. Those realities do not excuse crimes against civilians, but humanitarian law does not require General Gotovina to do the impossible. It does not presuppose that he operated in ideal or hypothetical circumstances. It does not consider whether in hindsight reality was different than how it appeared to him at the time. It does not assume that faced with grave and imminent peril, he had limited time and resources to train a professional army at the highest standards with the most sophisticated weaponry. All that humanitarian law demands of General Gotovina is that he acted reasonably given the realities of the war that was waged on the newly independent Croatian nation. But that's not the standard underlying the prosecution case. Throughout this proceeding, the prosecution has stretched, distorted, diluted, or simply disregarded the law. It has done so to create a standard so exacting, so unrealistic, that it would result in General Gotovine's conviction no matter how reasonably he acted. It is a contrived standard that attempts to compensate for the insufficiency of the evidence that on any reasonable interpretation must result in an acquittal. Let us consider what the prosecution's opening statement referred to as the core of its case, namely the allegation that a JCE existed forcibly displaced the Serbian civilian population through widespread and systematic unlawful shelling. At the pretrial stage, the defense Rule 72 submissions argued, consistent with ICTY jurisprudence, that whether charged as war crimes or crimes against humanity, deportation and forcible transfer only apply to territories under the actual control of an opposing belligerent. We submitted that the allegations of unlawful shelling prior to the liberation of so-called Krajina could only be charged as unlawful attacks and not deportation. In response, the prosecution argued vigorously that such a charge was not required because the definition of deportation under the laws of war is inapplicable to crimes against humanity. Prosecution then abruptly changed its position and amended count 1 of the indictment to add what we still maintain is a new charge of persecutory unlawful attacks against civilians and civilian objects. The prosecution now admits that to constitute an actus reus of crimes against humanity, shelling can only be unlawful if it violates the laws of war. But the prosecution final brief completely ignores the authorities at paragraph 860 of the defense final brief on the exclusion of pre-occupation hostilities from the law of deportation. At paragraph 482 of its brief, the prosecution persists in the theory that unlawful shelling prior to occupation satisfies the requirements of deportation. Now, consistent with paragraph 11 of its pretrial brief, the prosecution's final brief confirms at paragraph 486 that only, quote, few civilians did not flee the shelling attack, end quote. Thus, the prosecution Brioni JCE theory rests entirely on proof beyond a reasonable doubt of mass expulsion resulting from widespread or systematic unlawful shelling prior to Croatia's liberation of the Krajina territory. Furthermore, it rests on a finding by this trial chamber that law on deportation includes pre-occupation hostilities contrary to ICTY jurisprudence and humanitarian law. On both counts, we submit the prosecution's core JCE theory manifestly fails. Let us disregard for a moment the profound legal flaws in the prosecution theory and assume that pre-occupation shelling can be a modality of deportation. The evidence of unlawful shelling is still so grossly inadequate that one has to ask how the prosecution could pursue such a charge in this case. The prosecution's submissions yesterday conjured images of Stalingrad in the Second World War, of cities and towns reduced to rubble and innocent civilians massacred by indiscriminate shelling. So this trial chamber has to ask, after 15 years of investigation and in view of such bold allegations, where is the evidence of this massive atrocity? Why is there no proof whatsoever that even a single civilian died as a result of unlawful shelling? Where are photographs of Knin reduced to rubble? Why are the positive findings of the UNMO and UNCIFOL investigations simply ignored? The prosecution case is simply hopeless. There is no case to answer. But instead of doing what is right, and dropping these baseless charges, the prosecution